Welcome to the Mongabay newscast. It's April 23rd, 2021, and I'm your host, Mike Gurecki, bringing you the news and inspiration from nature's front line. Today we discuss the tales of two tuna, Yellowfin in the Indian Ocean and Bluefin in the Atlantic. These are two tales of overfishing and population collapse that help us understand some of the most pressing issues in international fisheries management today. Our first guest today is Mongabay staff writer Malavika Vayawahare, who recently wrote a two-part series of articles looking at the impacts of European tuna fishing on the economy and marine environment of Seychelles, an archipelagic nation in the Indian Ocean. Vayawahare tells us about the EU-controlled ships that dominate the annual yellowfin tuna haul in the Indian Ocean, why a plan to save the collapsing stock of yellowfin tuna in the Indian Ocean has failed, and how the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission, or IOTC, the intergovernmental agency that manages tuna fisheries in the region, has become a sort of battleground between EU member countries and smaller developing island nations like Seychelles. We also welcome to the program Jen Telesca, an assistant professor of environmental justice at the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York, and author of the recent book Red Gold, The Managed Extinction of the Giant Bluefin Tuna. Telesca discusses the history of the bluefin tuna trade, how the Atlantic bluefin became an endangered species, and how the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tunas, or ICAT, an intergovernmental organization responsible for the management and conservation of tuna in the Atlantic Ocean, has presided over what Tulesca calls the managed extinction of the Atlantic bluefin tuna.
The vast majority of people in their everyday have no idea what the life world of a sea creature is like. And that helps to create the conditions for an institution like ICAT to come along and just merely regulate the animal as if she's just a commodity passively awaiting consumption.
As staff writer Malavika Vayawahare reported for Mongabay earlier this month, the yellowfin tuna stock in the Indian Ocean is on the verge of collapse, and many experts say that the European Union countries that profit most from the fishery should be doing more to help save it. The EU, for its part, contends that other member countries of the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission, or IOTC, should be subject to greater restrictions. In reporting this story, Vayawahare found that vessels flagged to EU countries and vessels flagged to small island nations like Seychelles, but ultimately owned by companies in Europe, are responsible for the majority of yellowfin overfishing. Yet the EU has put forward a less than ambitious proposal to restore the yellowfin stock, leading to allegations that the EU is engaging in a neo-colonial plunder of resources that many developing countries depend on. Vayawahare says that she first began to report this story after looking into the use of FADs, or fish aggregating devices, which are themselves part of the problem of overfishing in the Indian Ocean.
A couple of months ago, I interviewed someone who was doing a cleaning drive on Aldabra Atoll. So that's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And I was wondering, what do you clean on an atoll that's just so remote out in the middle of the Western Indian Ocean, where nobody actually lives because it's just a coral atoll with those big, they are called Seychelles giant tortoises. They're endemic to Seychelles. So they are there. The corals are there. There's the big lagoon. But it turns out that actually, even on this remote island, there is just a lot of garbage. So when I heard about this, I was also told by the researchers that some of it is like flip-flops. So these are like flip-flops people wear, and I guess they get dumped into the ocean, and they find a home in some of these remote islands like Aldabra. And the other interesting bit that came out of that interview was that there was a lot of fishing debris. A large portion, and the estimate from that study was about 80% of the garbage, the trash that's on Aldabra is coming from fishing related trash. So this is basically fishing nets. There are buoys, round, colorful, floating things that you see that sometimes hold nets up. A lot of this garbage was showing up on the island, and it was pointed out to me that there's a big tuna fisheries that operates in the region. And I thought to myself, yeah, this is worth pursuing. One of the more important things of that was something called FADs, which became the second sort of part of my reporting. They are called fish aggregating devices, and they're exactly that. These are basically fishing aids which are used in tuna fisheries.
Fads are floating objects that are designed and strategically placed to attract pelagic fish like tuna, making it easier for fishing vessels to find their prey. They're usually made of buoys or floats and rope fishing lines or chains, and aside from being a source of trash in oceans and along coastlines, they pose a significant threat to sea turtles and marine mammals who can become entangled in them and drown.
So that was how I started. I was basically hooked by the fads. And then it sort of mushroomed into this 2-part series.
You open the first article talking about a ship called the Playa de Anzoras. Tell us how that vessel is sort of emblematic of the issues you explore in part 1 of the series.
You hear the word Playa de Anzoras, and if you know a little bit about language, you know that it's Spanish. I got to this ship because the question I asked myself was, okay, so there's a European tuna fisheries operating in this region. Are they the only ones? And what I realized was that fads are basically used by big vessels, which are called purse seine vessels. These vessels use massive nets. They can be about 1 kilometer or 2 kilometers if you laid them out flat to fish the tuna. And the Europeans have a major fleet of purse seine vessels that operates in the Western Indian Ocean. But also what struck me was that Seychelles, which is located in the Western Indian Ocean, and Aldabra is part of Seychelles. So it's an archipelagic sort of nation. It has more than 100 islands spread across the Western Indian Ocean. And in some ways, it would make sense that Seychelles has a substantial purse seine tuna fishing fleet. But then I looked at the names of the vessels, and a lot of them were just Spanish names, and I kind of pursued that. And also, what struck me was that here is EU. This is a big fishing sort of block, and here's Seychelles, which is just tiny. I mean, I think they are 2 times the size of Washington DC, just if you take just their land surface. And this country, this island, sort of small coastal island nation, has a fishing fleet which is kind of comparable to what Spain has in these waters. And it just struck me as odd. And so when I pursued that, it turned out that actually the entire Seychelles fleet is controlled by European companies. And one of those ships that flies the flag of Seychelles. So when I say Seychelles fleet, it basically means that the vessel flies the flag of Seychelles, but the ownership of that vessel, ultimately, you can trace it back to, in the case of the Playa de Anzoras, you can trace it back to a Spanish company called Pevasa, and it's based, if you look up the records there, it's based in Spain, where it's basically headquartered. So that's how you say it's a Spanish company. So actually, this was a very interesting part of the whole issue about the collapse of the yellowfin tuna. And I say that because sustainability of the yellowfin tuna stock in the Indian Ocean is a major issue. It's, we are kind of talking about a collapse of the stock, not in decades, but in years, like in 5 years, according to one estimate. So by 2026, this stock could collapse. When you say, okay, the stock is going to collapse, and the next question is really, so who is responsible for this, for us being in this position? And which sort of, allowed me to sort of look closely into the people who are fishing, which countries, which fleets. And it turned out, if you look at the data, that the European Union really dominates tuna fisheries in this region. And they do that not just by having, vessels that are flagged to European Union states, and these are mainly it's France and Spain, but also they have fleets like the Seychelles fleet, and which basically are owned by European Union companies, and they're called the beneficiary owners because they are ultimately in control of the vessel. And by having these other fleets, flagged to other countries but owned by European Union companies, if you put all their catches, like if you look at how much tuna all together, like Seychelles, Mauritius, and EU is fishing, you can really see the footprint of the European Union tuna fisheries in the Indian Ocean.
Right, and so Mauritius is another small island nation in the Western Indian Ocean that has a fleet of fishing vessels entirely owned by European companies, in this case French companies. Do you have the numbers on how much of the catch EU companies control through both their EU-flagged ships and their Seychelles or Mauritius-flagged fleets?
So there are 2 things. One is that in tuna fisheries, like I said, the porcine fisheries is an big industrial fisheries which has been operating in this part of the world for about more than 3 decades now. And tuna fish, porcine vessels take in most of the tuna from, I'm talking specifically of yellowfin tuna here. So they take in most of the yellowfin tuna. If you look at porcine fisheries in itself, the European Union just dominates this part of the fisheries because it has the vessels, it has the technology to do so. So I think if you look at the past 5 years, and you can go further, but in our story, we put in the numbers for the last 5 years, which shows that if you look at Mauritius, Seychelles, and EU boats combined, it'll be about 80% of the yellowfin tuna that's been hauled in by EU-controlled ships. And then if you look at the total sort of yellowfin tuna that's caught and over many decades now, the EU, I think, pulls in about a third, or about, I think, a quarter to about a third of all the tuna, and this is over like 3 decades, right? So compared to like any of the other countries which fish in this region, it's by far the largest share of catch over many years.
You write that a plan to stop overfishing and restore the yellowfin population failed. That would be the yellowfin tuna stock rebuilding plan adopted by the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission in 2016. Why did it fail?
The alarm about what was happening to the yellowfin tuna, basically started ringing after the IOTC kind of did this analysis in 2014-15 about the status of the stock, and they found that it was overfished and it was continuing to be, overfishing was basically continuing of yellowfin tuna. So the 2016 rebuilding plan was a response to this really sort of worrying finding. The way they decided to do this was to basically set up catch limits, which is to say you take a baseline year and see how much fish is being caught by a particular member, and then they imposed on porcine vessels specifically, for example, they imposed like a 15% reduction. So this was starting from 2017. So the plan came into being in 2016. From 2017, members were supposed to put in place reductions, implement these reductions. So 2017-18, they were supposed to have reduced their catch by 15%. This is for porciners. What really happened was that, in plain and simple words, they didn't. Because the IOTC essentially is an intergovernmental agency. It's not a supranational agency, which is to say that these are basically members coming together and saying, okay, so here we have a problem. What do we do about it? Let's find a way to get out of this mess. But the thing is that to implement those measures that are agreed upon by the IOTC, the responsibility still falls on the member states, because the IOTC really doesn't have that kind of enforcement muscle to enforce these measures. So what it does is basically say, okay, you're supposed to implement these reductions. Please do it and report to us that you've done it. And it turned out that actually the EU fishing fleet didn't make these reductions. The Seychelles fleet didn't make these reductions in, I think, 2 of the years. And I'm not sure which ones, but they didn't sort of follow exactly what was a part of the plan. Anyway, so the catch reductions haven't been a great success. And then in terms of like penalties for not reducing the catch, what the IOTC did was say that if you overfish in a particular year, we'll just reduce your catch for the next year. But then for actually overfishing, for violating that limit, there's actually really no penalty. So nobody's like fining them and saying, okay, you made a mistake here, these are the consequences of it. So there's nothing of that. And then also I want to point out that the plan leaves out a lot of fleets that use other gear, because they have there are thresholds for how much how much fish you must be catching for you to be under the scope of the regulation and those cuts. And then certain tiers are excluded, and under a certain threshold you're not part of the regulations. So what happens is that if you know the Indian Ocean, you know there are multiple countries here. Even if they are catching a small amount which doesn't fall under the threshold or doesn't meet the threshold limit for being under regulation, or has smaller fleets that don't fall under the plan, it basically adds up, and you still end up fishing, a lot of tuna. And for EU specifically, if you see, even after the IOTC plan came into being, what happened was that the EU flag boats reduced their catch, but then Mauritius saw like a big jump in their catch, in which they by some sort of, it's kind of a loophole in some ways. They managed to increase their catch by almost double from their 2014 standards, the baseline. So anyway, so ultimately there was, overfishing wasn't reduced. So we are still kind of, and there was a meeting in March to discuss this issue, and it got stalled as well. So there was no resolution. So that's where we are at.
I wonder if you could give us a brief history here, because you mentioned in your piece that Indian Ocean tuna stocks only started to really be targeted after the profitability of tuna fisheries in the Atlantic Ocean began to decline.
Right. Well, actually, this is not sort of a recent development, because what's happened is that EU vessels, well, I mean, Europe in general has always had prowess in the fishing sector. It has technology, it has vessels for decades, maybe centuries now. And the fishing sector, the tuna fishery sector is very well developed in Europe. So, I mean, the move towards the Indian Ocean happened in the 1980s and, mid 1980s. And that was because you have to realize that before this, the fishing levels in the Indian Ocean is very low. So what you're looking at is like an abundant stock, as opposed to a stock that's already being sort of, used and some ways misused and abused. So there is this abundant stock, and this was like mid 1980s. But now what you're seeing is you're kind of seeing a bit of a replay of that overexploitation happening in the Indian Ocean. So I mean, we're just going to run out of oceans, actually, if we just keep, sort of hopping from one to the other and leading fish stocks to really their collapse. So yes, it is a little bit depressing, and there has to be some sort of end to this. I don't know if this Indian Ocean thing is what's going to bring that about.
Tell us a bit about how the IOTC has become a battleground over the competing claims of EU member countries and developing nations in the Indian Ocean like Seychelles, and why EU countries are being criticized as neo-colonialist for the way they're approaching this issue.
You're right in saying that the IOTC has in some way become a battleground, and I like to sort of compare it a little bit with what is happening with the sort of climate negotiations with some of the developing countries being pitted against developed countries. And really the issue there is to sort of put the problem in historical context. And I think some of the allegations of European Union sort of indulging in neo-colonial tactics arises from the fact that it's a sort of a continuing dominance of European Union in this region. And so what the EU's really sort of the stand and what they appear to be saying is that, look, here's the problem, and it looks like all these other countries have also been in some ways overfishing or overexploiting the stock. And if you look at it today, all of these countries should take more responsibility for the problem that we have. And some of these other countries, the developing coastal states, who actually share a coast with the Indian Ocean, you have to realize that the European Union operates like a distant water fishing fleet. So they don't have, at least continental Europe doesn't have any sort of coast with the Indian Ocean. So here are countries who are fishing in their own neighborhood, sometimes within their own economic zones.
Every country is entitled to an exclusive economic zone extending 200 nautical miles from its coastline per the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea.
And here is a distant water fishing, group, the EU, which basically is telling them that, please stop overfishing in your own waters, for a stock that it has actually helped bring to the level in many ways of collapse. And these other fishing nations would be in some ways able to benefit from this stock over a longer period of time if the European Union hadn't sort of been exploiting it for so long and to such an extent. But you have to be mindful of the fact that whatever the differences between these like sort of two blocks, the fact is that the stock is nearing a sort of collapse. So I think in terms of the IOTC sort of back and forth, both blocks will have to sort of accept their responsibility in some ways, and if we are to sort of make any progress on this issue. And another thing that I'd like to point out in terms of this allegation of new colonialism is that you will see that the Indian Ocean, especially countries here in the Western Indian Ocean, like Comoros, Madagascar, Mauritius, these countries have been under sort of colonial rule for decades, maybe centuries in some cases. And now that over the recent decades when they have gained independence, these countries have access to a resource that European Union does not have in some ways. They are rich, they're abundant in these marine resources, and when the European Union offers to sort of get into these agreements and partnerships which allow its ships to harvest these resources, because these countries, some of them just don't have the technical capacity. They've been under colonial rule for many years. It's one of the reasons they are not very well developed. One of the reasons. They don't have their own fleets. So now you have a block that has much more money. So essentially the agreements that these countries had with the EU were in the beginning just fish pay and go. So they just gave them money to be able to exploit these resources. So the point is that if you're exploiting another country's resources, then I guess the idea is that you have some responsibility to ensure that those resources persist. You cannot just be coming in, practicing fishing in a way that leads those resources to disappear in some ways. What about the future generations that are going to come in these countries? Like, they will not have access to those resources. So that's, I think, one of the bases for the argument for neocolonialism. And the other thing is, of course, that we have to also realize that, the fish that's being fished by the purse-seine vessels, most of it goes to being processed and sold as canned tuna. And what the European Union vessels do is they bring in the tuna, they process them in canneries in Seychelles, which is one of the biggest. It has one of the biggest canneries, and most of it is basically sold back or exported to European Union countries. And they're exported to European Union countries basically import duty free, because EU also has an agreement with these countries that they can sell their sort of canned tuna to Europe without paying the 24% import duty, which is a very big incentive. But the point is that the cannery itself is only it's 60% owned by a Thai union, another foreign player. The vessels that are bringing in the tuna are controlled by Europe. The tuna is going to Europe. So I mean, the entire system in some ways is geared towards European interests. So the question really is whether it serves the interests of the coastal countries, and then whether it serves the interests of sustainability, the way it's structured.
You quote Nirmal Shah, chief executive of the nonprofit Nature Seychelles and former head of the Seychelles Fishing Authority, who says they, meaning the EU, give us trinkets for our treasure.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if you look at just the numbers, there's definitely a big discrepancy in terms of how much the EU is paying in terms of fishing access fees and other sort of compensation that the countries, the coastal states get through these agreements. And if you look at how much companies, and this is really hard to pin down because there's a lot of opacity in this sector, but if you look at how much market value, what the market value of that tuna is, there's definitely a big markup. And even if you account for the fact that there's processing and there's value addition, etc., the EU companies are definitely profiting a great deal. and the coastal states are not seeing as much profits. And I like, as I pointed out, even the canneries are not really entirely in the control of the coastal states. So you can talk about, how much revenues they are getting from this like tuna industry. The number of jobs are, I mean, they are significant, but they're not as the proportion of Seychelles employed in that cannery is like 30%. So, I mean, they're not, the job argument is not as strong as it could be. So, yeah, there's really a calculation to be made about how much benefits they're really getting from this system.
You note that a new EU Seychelles agreement was signed last year, and it sets aside money for an environment fund and seeks to phase out the use of fats. But ships like the Playa de Anzoras are not subject to those regulations. Why not?
Right. So the EU and Seychelles, the most recent agreement, it's now called the Sustainable Fishing Partnership Agreement. It's been hyped a lot that for the first time, environmental considerations are being included as part of this agreement. Well, you might want to ask, I mean, given that there were 5 agreements before that, and the fisheries, this kind of arrangement has been going on for so long, how come the environmental considerations are making it into the agreements now? So that's definitely a question that I did put to the EU. I did not really get a substantial enough response to include in the piece. Then the other thing is that, so there are 2 main sort of, or the positive aspects in terms of the environment. So what they're doing is they're creating a fund which basically will help Seychelles protects its marine riches because they have a very huge EEZ.
EEZ or EEZ is shorthand for Exclusive Economic Zone.
They're trying to expand the protected area network, etc. So this money is going to go towards that. And then there's also this provision with regard to fads, which the EU had said that vessels shall start using something called biofads from 2022. So that's next year. Now the thing is, biofads, the term refers to fads, the fishing devices. Usually these are made of like a floating structure and then like a underwater trail which is made of like nylon netting usually, and a lot of it is like, some of it of the floating part of the structure can be like PVC pipe, so it's really actually plastic heavy. What they want to do is make it more environmentally friendly, so have like biodegradable material be used in those fads. The other thing is to make it non-entangling. So this is what the biofad means. It means that the material is biodegradable and it's non-entangling. The non-entangling bit is important because these fads are, I think, 100,000 of them are released into the oceans every year, and this is kind of an underestimate. There are a lot of fads being, deployed in the oceans. A lot of them, especially the drifting fads, are being left there by the ships because they have really not enough incentives to retrieve them. So what you have is just like these floating, plastic sort of structures which are not going to decompose. They actually do lead to turtles and sharks getting entangled in all that netting that's just lying around in the ocean in some ways. So that's the purpose of the biofad, is to tackle those problems. Now the issue is that the EU said, our ships shall start using them. But when I spoke to the representative of the Spanish tuna industry, he told me flat out that 2022 is just it's not realistic, that we're not at a stage. And I think the story goes into that. If you read it, you'll realize that actually it's been years in development, these things called biofads, and they're really not, there's no urgency to develop them. The industry doesn't seem to be, in the mode to shift towards biofad. And frankly, some people say that biofads are not part of the solution. They are just, they create the same problems as fads, maybe at a less lower. It's just a smaller evil, but it's definitely a problem to a biofad. And then lastly, to your point about the Playa de Anzoras and other ships that are flagged to coastal states, what I'd like to point out is that the EU-Seychelles agreements basically cover ships that are flagged to the EU. So none of these provisions apply to ships that are flagged to Seychelles itself. And even if their beneficial owners are in Europe, since the ship is not flagged to a European Union state, none of these agreements just don't apply to those ships. So how effective this agreement and its provisions will be remains to be seen.
Now we turn to our second tuna tale with Jen Telesca, author of Red Gold, The Managed Extinction of the Giant Bluefin Tuna, which was published last year by the University of Minnesota Press. In the book, Tulesca makes the case that despite the endangered status of Atlantic bluefin tuna, the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tuna, referred to as ICAT, has not failed its institutional mission. Rather, Tulesca argues ICAT has succeeded in the task it was given by international law, which is not to preserve the Atlantic Ocean's marine life, but to maximize fishing in order to grow national economies. She suggests that the solution to halting the collapse of Atlantic bluefin tuna populations is not just institutional reform, but also a wholesale reform to the dominant culture that has led to overfishing in the first place. The impetus for the book, Tulesca tells us, has its roots in her upbringing in a fishing community where she first encountered giant Atlantic bluefin tuna.
I grew up on Eastern Long Island, and so as a kid, I've seen the giants firsthand, walking the docks off of Shinnecock and Montauk inlets. And over time, I've seen the marine environment degrade before my eyes in my lifetime. And so there was this moment when I effectively had to decide a dissertation topic years ago. And I remember I was on a kayak. I kayak quite frequently, actually, and it was on Thanksgiving morning. And I was just overwhelmed by this feeling that the eelgrass that I knew from my childhood was gone, that the horseshoe crabs that I knew from childhood had gotten a lot smaller and fewer in number. And I just felt compelled, also knowing that my dad and my brothers, who would often go fishing, would effectively not go fishing as often because there's just not many fish to catch anymore. And so I just wanted to know, I entered the project trying to understand what decision makers in positions of power were doing in order to create the conditions for an ocean emptying of wild fish.
And the book, of course, deals heavily with the fisheries management regime of ICAT, which you write formed after World War II when the slaughter of sea creatures happened on a scale and at a pace never before known on Earth. Can you tell us a bit about the history and founding mission of ICAT?
Interestingly, it's really in the immediate aftermath of World War II that you start to get industrialized countries sending their fleets out across the globe to catch as many fish as possible. And so by the late 1950s, certainly by the early 1960s, scientists, fishers were already well aware of the fact that creatures such as the bluefin in the Atlantic had suffered a tremendous drop in their size and numbers. And so in the 1960s, you see movements by the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN to create institutions formally in place to protect these sea creatures. And yet, so when ICAT forms, formally by treaty in 1969, there's the sense in which ICAT emerges out of the crisis of overfishing. Right? So ICAT emerges at a time when maritime nations were already well aware that there was an overfishing crisis on our hands. And in the half century since ICAT formed, there's been a hastening of extraction and hastening of extermination in ways that don't conform to the public expectation that these creatures are actually being conserved.
And you argue in the book that conserving marine life is not actually the purpose of ICAT.
I think one of the things that is important for people to understand is that ICAT effectively does the job asked of it by international law. So you see in the immediate aftermath of World War II, and this is a moment when the United States, recall, accounts for about a third of global economic output, right? Because at this point, Europe and Japan, their economies were effectively decimated from war. And the US, as it's starting to emerge as a global superpower alongside the former Soviet Union, you get these efforts inside of these burgeoning regulatory regimes to figure out how they can extract as much fish as possible. Because at the time, people they assumed that fish were a resource, quote, that could forever be replaced. Right? It's the idea, the logic of there's always another fish in the sea. And so in 1955, there's this very important moment when nation states in Rome, where the Food and Agricultural Organization is based, agreed by a one vote margin to say, yes, we will agree to the juridical formula of what is known as maximum sustainable yield, which creates the conditions, the ways in which science, fisheries science and mathematics is used in a way to rationalize and justify the perceived inventory at sea. And so I think it's really important for people to understand then that an institution like ICAT and the whole plethora of other organizations like it that manage fish on the high seas, but then also even regionally, because the principle of maximum sustainable yield, MS-wide, is really the basic. It's the basis. It's the foundation of fisheries management, that in many ways, they're really just doing the job asked of them. And this is important to understand because in many ways, the popular discourse imagines these institutions as if they're inept, as if they're corrupt, as if they're just like fumbling bureaucracies. And that's not at all the case. They're actually, in some respects, organized with impressive efficiency. The extermination of, countless numbers of wild fish over decades. And in many ways, we're on the receiving end now of understanding just how great of a job actually they've done, given the extraordinary depletion of wild fish.
Yeah, the very title of your book suggests ICAT hasn't stopped the slaughter of marine life. That's what you mean by the managed extinction of Atlantic bluefin tuna?
Yeah, I think again, kind of piggybacking on the previous comment, I think it's important for people to understand, and important for people to understand as citizens who send representatives to these organizations, that it's important for citizens to understand that in many ways, organizations like ICAT haven't just overseen the slaughter, right? They've provoked it, and they'll continue to do so unless the dominant culture under what I would call extractive capitalism no longer consents to the carnage. And so, or at least if people no longer remain alienated and ill-informed about how they get their food and what incredible creatures fish are. And so the managed extinction is there for people to recognize that we have to have better accounts of how it is we've gotten to a place of what some people convincingly refer to as the Sixth Extinction.
Scientists are increasingly warning that we are in the midst of a sixth global mass extinction event, driven primarily by human activities.
So we need, or the Anthropocene, right? So we have to have, so it's, in other words, it's more than just trying to see what the oil and gas industry is doing and turning our attention to the so-called greedy capitalists. And I think in many ways, part of what the book invites the reader to reflect upon is the degree to which regulations through these institutions have contributed tremendously to the decline in wild fish populations.
So when the ICAT convention entered into force in 1969, bluefin tuna wasn't yet considered red gold. Can you tell us the history of how it became such a prized fish that we're driving it to extinction?
This is such an important question. I'm so glad you're asking this, Mike, because, so if we appreciate that ICAT emerged at a time when maritime nations already knew we had an overfishing problem on our hands. At the same time, when creatures like the bluefin were extracted, the bluefin predominantly at the time, by the late 1960s, went to canneries, or recreational fishers, quite literally would dock them and either throw them overboard at port, at marinas, or they, because some of them were so large, they would take bulldozers and bury them underneath the sand. And so part of what happens by the early 1970s, when you start to get a resurgent Japan, there's this sense in which there was effectively a trade imbalance between Japan and its trading partners. And so that Japan was exporting processed goods or electronics, but when those products were coming back, when airplanes, especially the advent of the jumbo jet, also around the same time, when they're coming back to Japan, those cargo holds were empty. And so the book recounts this moment when the national airlines, JAL Airlines of Japan, basically sent out scouts and realized that they could import live creatures such as the bluefin from abroad in those cargo hulls. And they had to, invent like a specific way in which to carry the fish. And so there's this really important moment in 1972 when it's quite famous, actually, at Tsukiji, at the famous fish marketplace in Tokyo, when fishmongers at Tsukiji tasted for the very first time bluefin caught in Atlantic waters. Because previous to that, they had only tasted bluefin from the Pacific. And so you start to see then the advent then of the global sushi economy happening in the early 1970s, with the bluefin emerging as the lead species in the sushi economy. And so part of what is also super interesting in many ways is that at the same time that you start to see the emergence of ICAT as an institution formally charged to oversee the catch of commercial fish on the high seas, you're also seeing the emergence in parallel of a global sushi economy. And so in some ways, I think one way to better understand what's going on is that the power of ICAT as the most prominent regional fisheries management organization, the most prominent RFMO, happens at the same time as the emergence of bluefin as the most expensive sushi money can buy. And so the vast majority of people aren't eating sushi until the late 70s, early 1980s. So, this is also a relatively recent development.
Can you say more about how ICAT helped Atlantic bluefin become this most prized fish? You write in the book that the authority ICAT has accrued in ocean governance has helped transform the bluefin into red gold.
So I think one of the important things to understand, too, is that it's not as if the bluefin emerges on the stage in the 1970s amongst connoisseurs of sushi in Japan. So even if we were to backtrack for a moment, I think it's also important to recognize that in the Mediterranean basin, so here I'm thinking of what is now present-day Portugal, Spain, France, Italy, and then also the countries that rim Northern Africa, that the bluefin in many ways has long been caught and canned or long been used as foodstuff in ways that conferred status onto rulers, right? So there's these famous stories of Roman emperors who would put, these monster bluefin on like banquet tables as a means to demonstrate their own power. And so in some ways, because in Europe, there was already a stronghold of bluefin in the cultural imagination, when the bluefin numbers were declining, and when the bluefin was declining in size in the 1950s, 1960s, that was really the impetus in general for ICAT to even form in the first place, because there was worry in Europe and North Africa about the decline in the bluefin. And so part of what the book tries to do too is to recognize the extraordinary cultural status of the bluefin, not only in Japan, but also in Europe, and then increasingly in the US, at least amongst recreational fishers, most famously Ernest Hemingway, right? And so there's the sense in which then the emergence of the bluefin as red gold comes in particular. There's this one moment that's very important in the early 1980s, when at the time the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea was just about to open for signature. And at this point, the U.S. delegation, so the U.S. is not still to this day, not formally a part of UNCLOS, of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And there's this very important moment when, at the surprise, even of members of the U.S. delegation, the lead negotiators put on the table the proposal to adopt export quotas for the bluefin. And this is a really important moment because this is the first time a high seas fish ever, especially again with UNCLOS newly on the scene. This moment in the early 1980s was when nation states, under the guidance of the U.S. delegation, agreed to effectively privatize the resource by adopting catch quotas. And so once you start to, again, I think it's important that people recognize that once you start to privatize the resource and you double down on the commodification, and at the same time, you're starting to get a global market in sushi, that these various forces start to come together by the late 1970s, certainly by the early 1980s. And then really, it's kind of almost, history from there, where you start to see then by the late 1980s, the recognition, even in publications like the New York Times, that there's a recognition that we have a problem on our hands. Right, that the size and number of bluefin start to decline.
Right, so the Atlantic bluefin tuna is listed as endangered on the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species, and its population numbers continue to decline. But at the same time, the size of Atlantic bluefin has been declining as well, right? I think that's important for people to understand, because it's also due to human activities.
Well, right, and I think what's really important also to acknowledge here is that the vast majority of people inside these regimes are worried about volume, right? They're worried about, in fisheries parlance, what's called like biomass. So they're worried about the total number of creatures, right? But at the same time, what we've lost really are those giants. And this matters tremendously because fish are not people, right? So the older and more mature a fish is, the more that fish contributes to future generations. And so, so the more eggs that fish lays, the bigger that fish is. And so I think there's a really important point here that there's often a preoccupation with the statistics and the numbers when just anecdotally, most people, at least if you're 30 and up, you had to have seen the decline in the size of the animal. And it's very, there's that one picture in the opening, in the prologue of the book.
The picture Telesca is referring to is of a fisherman named Ken Fraser in Nova Scotia, Canada, standing next to a giant bluefin tuna, the largest all-tackle bluefin ever recorded at 1,496 pounds or 679 kilos. The fish is hung by its tail and is easily twice as long as the fisherman is tall.
And it's really, in some ways, kind of tells you much of what you need to know, which is to say that the bluefin no longer grows to be that big anymore. And to the point now where if you see a bluefin 600-700 pounds, that makes the news. And yet when I was a kid, that was, bluefin were landed at 600-700 pounds. Like that was normal. And I guess maybe an analogy would be, it would be kind of like, imagine if we just got rid of all of our elders and we had a human population of just teenagers. It's kind of what it's like.
I think one of the points you make in the book most eloquently is that the very language we use when we talk about species like the bluefin as biological assets that we inventory and consider to be commodities available for extraction, that has helped lead us into this sixth global mass extinction event.
Yeah, I think there's at least 2 points to make here. So on the one hand, it's the kind of thing where the vast majority of people have no idea of the extraordinary majesty and wonder that the bluefin and other creatures inspire. This is an animal that is warm-blooded, that is somewhere on the evolutionary scale between a cold-blooded cod and a warm-blooded blue whale. Which explains why the bluefin's meat is red. Right, so she has heat exchangers that allow her to elevate the internal temperature of her body higher than surrounding water. So this is an animal that can cross the entire Atlantic Ocean in 40 days and somehow find that 9-mile stretch of the Strait of Gibraltar to enter the Mediterranean Sea. She enjoys one of the longest migrations of any fish on the planet. The only fish that matches her speed is a sailfish. Right, so effectively, eating a bluefin is like eating a cheetah, right? And a very large cheetah at that. And so, there's this sense in which the vast majority of people in their everyday have no idea what the life world of a sea creature is like. And that helps to create the conditions for an institution like ICAT to come along and just merely regulate the animal as if she's just a commodity passively awaiting consumption. And I think that the second point to make here, one of the chapters in the book explicitly tries to unpack what the role of science is inside these regimes. At ICAT, this is not a world of Sir David Attenborough and the Blue Planet. What happens inside these regimes isn't, people sitting around a conference table talking about what incredible creatures these are. This is a space where the dominant science is what's called population dynamics. And you see inside these zones, scientists, fishery scientists that are formally entrusted to effectively count and measure and rationalize the inventory that nation states then agree to go out and catch with the backing of their industry. And so the other important point I think to make here is that the commodification of the animal is also sanctioned by fishery science inside these zones. And so the scientists aren't there to act as the reasoned voice of conservation or to act as the restraint on commercial catch. It's actually quite the opposite. The science is used to leverage and rationalize even more extraction. And at a certain level, that must be the case if now, a half century since ICAT has formed, right? So ICAT's been around now for a half century. If the bluefin and other creatures under ICAT's remit have declined in size and number, then again, we have to ask more probing questions as, so how is it that we've even gotten to this point to begin with?
So what do we do to remedy this situation? Presumably we could change the way we talk about animals like the bluefin, because changing the language we use would help change the way we think about them and ultimately how we treat them. But you also write that the ICAT regime must be dislodged and replaced by something else. What is that something else?
Yeah, I think, again, maybe 2 points here. So on the one hand, we have on our hands an institution that is the product of technoscientific managerial way of thinking that privileges extraction to the benefit of industry. So in other words, that ICAT is not in a position to ensure the longevity of small-scale artisanal fishers. Right? This is an institution that is leveraged and in many ways helps to create the conditions for what effectively are a very small number of industrialized extractors. And so, and again, you see the way in which the regulations in place are a reflection of the dominant values in society that merely treat the animal as commodity. And so I think there's a sense in which, on the one hand, inside these zones, there needs to be a revaluation of maximum sustainable yield, of how do we incorporate the voices of small-scale fishers? How do we incorporate indigenous worldviews? What would it mean if we used a fisheries science that was not indebted to accounting methods and actually took seriously the fact that these are wildlife that, so in other words, rather than use mathematical models to count the number of fish, there's also, some really interesting studies that I've seen. I can't say I've seen them with the bluefin per se, but, that there's, that fish are like birds and they sing with the first sunlight. And if we can acoustically imagine and measure the strength of their sound, we might be able to know actually how many there are. Right? So there are other ways beyond extraction that might get us to a place to really encourage a reverence for the majesty of these animals, right? So that we get outside of a worldview that thinks that we have to save the fish, right? And that instead, I think what we need are people inside these zones and the public at large to better appreciate these animals in ways that help us understand that this is about mutual care. This is about stewardship on a shared planet, right? And so, and I guess that brings me to in addition to the reforms that need to happen inside these zones, right? So that the very grammar, like MSY,
that's maximum sustainable yield,
needs to be reformulated. I mean, there's no question about it. And in many ways, this critique about MSY has been going on for decades, but yet no one is really listening, or at least not inside these zones. And then I think the second point, especially, I'm imagining a potential, someone on the, listening to our discussion, that, there's sometimes a tendency for people to fall back on a default position where people see themselves as consumers, freely acting in a world of markets. And if they just have enough purchasing power, that will be enough to stem the slaughter. I think what also needs to happen alongside of changes, deep institutional reform, what also needs to happen alongside that deep institutional reform is that everyday people see themselves less as consumers and more as citizens making demands on their government, such that the change that we need has to happen where we scale and leverage the power of the state to initiate meaningful change. And in many ways here, this is where I think about work that's coming out of the environmental justice field and thinking about how we as citizens make demands on our governments in order to reclaim our common home so that these institutions better serve everyday people and better protect and conserve meaningfully the creatures under their remit rather than effectively being global trade by regulatory means.
If you enjoy the Mongabay newscast, we ask that you please help spread the word by telling a friend. That's the best way to help expand our reach and keep the show growing. Another way to help is by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Mongabay. We are a nonprofit news outlet, so just $1 or more per month would really help us offset production costs and hosting fees. If you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, please head to patreon.com/Mongabay to learn more and support the Mongabay newscast. That's patreon.com/Mongabay. You and your friend can join the listeners who've downloaded this podcast more than 250,000 times by subscribing to the Mongabay newscast wherever you get your podcasts from. Or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either app store for the Mongabay newscast app to gain fingertip access to all of our new shows and all of our previous episodes. And of course, you can read all of our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mongabay.com, or if you prefer to keep up with us on social media, follow us at facebook.com/Mongabay, or on Twitter and Instagram. Our handle is @Mongabay on both of those platforms. Thanks as always for listening to the Mongabay newscast. I'm your host, Mike Gorecki, signing off. Talk to you again in 2 weeks.